So today we're going to be talking to some students who have been taught history through Kentucky schools. And we're going to get their perspective on how well this history has been taught to them. We're going to get their perspective on what they want to see in the future and how this type of teaching can help shape them in terms of achieving their academic goals in the future, achieving their professional goals in the future, etc. So we're really excited to be talking to these students today. So as we talk to these students, I would like for our audience to really take notes and also think about some questions that you would like to ask them. Make sure that you really are listening to their stories and understanding that the impact, what impact Black history and culture has had on them as students, and think about what you would do as teachers to help shape their future moving forward. I think it's very important that as teachers, as educators, that you really look from the perspective of the students, what the impact your words, what the impact that the pedagogy will have on them and their futures as citizens of this country. So we have our students in our Zoom room right now. And the first thing I would like for our students to do is to introduce themselves. So let's start with Julieruss. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, Julie?
Absolutely. So, hello. Thank you for having me here today. I am a senior at Highlands High School in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, and I'm really excited to speak about this topic with my peers, learn from them, as well as kind of discuss the systemic issues that we're seeing with our curriculum, especially in Kentucky. So, thank you for having me.
To introduce is Emil Wilson. Emil, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, yes. Hello. My name is Emil Wilson. I am a senior at Harlan County High School, and I'm just glad to be here.
Our next student is Sydney Locke. Sydney, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be on this panel today. I am from Louisville, Kentucky, and I am a senior at Northern Kentucky University. And here at Northern, I major in elementary education.
So to our student panelists, we're going to start out by answering this question. Would you please describe your experience with being taught Black history and culture in school? And be specific. Give us some specific examples about your experiences. And more importantly, please evaluate those experiences from your perspective. And we can start out with Julie.
All right. In Fort Thomas Independent Schools, we are a very white district. And the entire time I've been in Fort Thomas, it's been that way. And I think for the most part, while teachers have tried to address Black history bit by bit, piece by piece, in some aspects of my history classes, ranging from fourth grade and fifth grade to up to the high school level, I have never thought that it was sufficient. For example, I remember in fifth grade, we learned about the Civil War, and it wasn't really expressly taught about why the Civil War was being fought. States' rights were brought up, but not exactly states' rights to what? To own slaves. It was a really interesting way to see how that differentiated when I was in eighth grade and we learned about it again. And I realized they didn't give me the whole story. And I felt like there's also been a lot of things that the severity of the experiences Black Americans have had to face throughout the entirety of history, like in our country, and before we were a country. I feel like those details, a lot of details were left out that provide a lot of context that is extremely important. So yeah, and then the high school level, I've the advanced placement courses I've taken also, I've noticed, haven't done a great job of really going in depth about Black history. And so I'll talk more about that later because I think that it's the College Board's duty as a standardized type of curriculum to deeply embed it more thoroughly. And I think that uh, public educators have a responsibility to demand that of corporations like the College Board or like the IB program, that type of thing. So that's just kind of quickly my take.
Coming back to you with some additional questions. I just want to let our audience know that we are missing 2 students, Dennis and Jayla. We hope they'll be joining us later. So let's move to Emil. And Emil, could you answer the same question that Julie just answered, specifically talking about your experience with learning Black history and culture in schools? And again, evaluate your experience and give us some specifics. Tell us your story.
Well, I remember one time in middle school, I was in the 5th grade and we were talking about the Mayflower. But I could see it in my teacher's face that she wasn't very comfortable with it. When we started talking about it, it wasn't very something she was comfortable explaining or even teaching. She felt very out of place. I had to go home and ask my mother, a few questions about it. I didn't really understand what the Mayflower was. A lot of kids talked about it in school, but they really didn't understand it. And as I went up even further in my grade levels, like the 8th grade, my teacher still, it was just like when Black History Month came along, that's when they really talked about it, but it wasn't still talked about. It was just bits and pieces from here and there. They just again, they just didn't seem comfortable with it, which I felt more out of place. I didn't really understand. Like, I know that it was a dark period in our history, but I would still like to understood like why it was so dark and why they did this. Like, I didn't understand the connection. And in high school, it's kind of the same thing. They never really continued with it. It was just something that if Black History Month came along, they would pick a moment in history or pick a certain person to talk about, or a certain Black person like Martin Luther King is who they stuck around, who they felt comfortable with talking about. And it kind of made it very hard for me throughout high school to understand my history. That's my history. I need to understand it a little bit more instead of going home and trying to find it when my teachers who are educated in this, who went to school for it, should be able to speak to me and teach me about this. This is my history. This is a lot of Black kids' history. And I go to a pretty white dominant school. I'm from a pretty white dominant town. And it's just something I guess they're afraid to talk about, or they just don't really like to bring up, which I think we really need to change in the school district. Thank you.
Thank you, Emil. So the same question to Sydney. Tell us about your experience learning Black history and culture in school. And again, give some specifics and evaluate your experience.
All right. So in elementary school, I would say that I gained a great foundation of Black history knowledge and culture. And fortunately, my teacher spent time teaching us the importance of Black history as well as celebrating Black history. Until this day, I remember many of my teachers creating different assignments and projects that will allow us to step in the shoes of an African American in history and then impersonate that person for the whole day so that we could learn more about them. So for example, I believe in 1st grade, I was Phyllis Wheatley for the day, and that allowed me to teach my peers about Phyllis Wheatley and who she was. So I really do remember that in elementary school. However, throughout middle and high school, my experience was very different than my experience in elementary school. In middle school and high school, in my social studies classes, they were more focused on specific events and dates in history. Like Julie said, like the Civil War. And because of that, and because of the rigorous classes, I would say in curriculum, because I was in AP classes in high school, Black history was not woven into those classes much. I do remember the option of having Black history every other year. And so with the curriculum and the classes that I did have at the time, my schedule did not align with having Black history classes. So although I gained a great foundation in elementary school, it was hard for me to continue to learn my history and culture in middle and high school. And if I didn't have my parents teaching me, as well as different programs that I was in Louisville, Kentucky, then I probably wouldn't have gained any more knowledge.
Great. So there was a common theme, at least with our first two students, that seemed to have come to focus. And that was that the teachers didn't feel comfortable teaching Black history and culture. Do you want to elaborate on that, either Julie or Emil? Why do you think they didn't feel comfortable teaching Black history?
Well, I think they didn't feel comfortable because I don't really think I guess they didn't understand it, or they felt like it would be, I think they felt like it would hurt the students to talk about it, because every time it was brought up, the teachers would automatically look at me or the other Black kid in my classroom, and they would just get really tensed and just get scared. And then all the other students would start looking. And I think they would just want to hit it real quick and move on. They didn't want to make us feel uncomfortable. But what teachers don't realize is this is very important for us. We don't feel comfortable. We need to know this. I feel like more Black people and more white people as a group should understand, and we need to remember, like, this is a part of our history. This is who we are as a nation. This is what happened. We cannot change it, but we can still learn from it. Even though it's happened many, many years ago, this is still part of our history. And it's very important that we have that fundament, like that sentiment value, like to understand it. I think that's just the biggest part of it all.
Julie, you also shared that sentiment. So why don't you elaborate on your feelings about that as well?
Absolutely. So I completely agree with Emil. And I would like to add that I think, so as someone who really has never had fellow Black classmates, or at least not many, in my history classes, you know, being in all white history classes, I think teachers feel less of a responsibility to talk about Black history. But I think that if that's the case, Black history should be touched on more, because obviously those students in those all white classes will have had less exposure to talks about Black history. And like Emil said, it is a part of our history that needs to be addressed, cannot be swept under the rug. It's absolutely critical that we talk about this, we have these conversations, especially when they're uncomfortable, because that uncomfortableness needs to be examined by white students and white teachers and white educational administrators, white people. We need to examine that and say, why are we uncomfortable with this? And we need to learn about these origins in order to kind of tackle them in a more systemic way, I think.
Awesome. We do have another student that has joined us, Jayla Pruett. Jayla, we had started out by asking our student panelists to talk about their experiences in learning Black history in school. And so if you could just briefly touch on your experiences in learning Black history and culture and evaluate that experience, and then give us some specifics about that.
Okay, so I'm a senior at Shelby County High School. That's not the school district that I went for elementary school, but throughout my elementary through high school experience, I feel like in elementary school, we talked about it more in an appreciative way. We always highlighted huge role models, usually that reflected civil rights or slavery, so Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But as we got older and got to high school, we did not cover any more subjects on it. Usually they reflect right back to slavery or Martin Luther King and civil rights. And personally, I think that we need to do more emphasis, not on something that traumatizing or struggling with, because Black people have a lot of influence on everything in African American history that's part of American history. So we need to have more awareness and appreciative towards other Black influencers and just history in general, whether it's sports or media or actors and all that, because they all contribute to history. Last year in high school was the first time we actually did something for Black History Month. We did like a poetry slam. So it was literature related. People would come in and they would like share poetry or videos that they saw, something that reflected Black history, and they would talk about it, why they like it, or how resonates with them. And it wasn't just for the Black students, it was for everybody that wanted to come and do it. Some students put that together. So just more awareness and not so much textbook and history and slavery, because it doesn't start with slavery. There's other things that we've done in history that needs to be.
So I'm going to make this so that we're going to have a conversation about what history is. And I'm going to start that by asking this question. So this summer, there was a lot of history made around Black Lives Matter protests, et cetera. And I'm just going to open this up and ask you, how do you think teachers should approach talking about what happened this summer and also this winter when you think about the impact that COVID has had on Black people? So think about that. What would you want to hear from your teachers if you were to think about this 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 years out? And I'll just open it up to the panel.
Well, right now we're living in the historical moment, as you said. For our society, this is something um, that's going to highlight issues that we're going to face further in the future and that we have faced in the past. And since we are the kids that probably will be in these positions later on in political standpoints, views, we need to be aware of what's caused these issues and how they're being handled and how to avoid them. So just having like a discussion or a talk about them and a synthesis way of just understanding why we allow these things to happen, or what's the cause of these things, and what's our emotions, or how are we empathetic towards it. Because a lot of times when people don't know something about something, it creates ignorance, and then there's no empathy for it to have a solution for it. So we just need to, have a discussion, talk open. People are going to agree or disagree, but just so we know what their standpoints and viewpoints are is what makes a solution to the problem.
Have anything you want to add to that?
I feel like as I was younger, current events was very important in elementary school. And I feel like as I got older, we start talking less about current events and more about past events. And I feel like current events are a representation of past events. And I feel like talking about BLM movement and everything that happened during the summer is just very important to have. I feel like biases and opinions should be left aside and just have a real factual conversation of exactly what's going on. And I also feel like comparing the movement of this summer as well as just different movements in the past and comparing the two and seeing how they have very common similarities will allow students to compare the two and see exactly how kind of history is repeating itself in a way.
Julie, you want to add anything to this question?
Yes. So I think that when it comes to Black Lives Matter, I think that it is a non-negotiable that all educators make it clear that Black lives do matter to them. There should be no questionable response. There should be no, well, there's people good and bad on both sides, because one side is Black people and the other side is people who hate Black people. And I think in education, there is no room for error when it comes to combating white supremacy. At the very least, at the surface level, because anti Black Lives Matter is surface level white supremacy. If we can't combat that, how are we going to combat the systemic things that are happening under the surface? I mean, I think that's the least we can ask of our educators. And I think it's their duty as educators to make sure that it's a safe space for all students, with no doubts.
Okay. Emil, you want to tackle that question, or we can move on to something else if you have no comments on that?
I don't have any comments. They pretty much talked about that very well.
I'm going to play teacher here. And I want you all to think about this question. Slavery is called the original sin of this country. When do you all think slavery ended in this country? And are we still dealing with the remnants of slavery? Emil, you're up on that. I mean, that's something that takes a little bit of time to process, but what do you think about that?
I really don't know if it so much ended, I guess to say. I don't know how I feel about that word because it ties into what happened this summer. It's just something that just stopped. I don't know if it was really ever truly ended because, to be truthful, people like white supremacy, they see us still as slaves. They don't see us as people. We're not people to them. We're supposed to be working for them. We're supposed to be like doing all these chores for them. Like, this is something that we don't have rights in their eyes. We're not supposed to. I don't truly feel as if we ever really left it. I think it just stopped for a minute and it just slowly progressed back up to this summer. And it just became something that people really just stopped and then picked right back up. It's something that I think communication was the big key. It's not being talked about. It's not being handled correctly. And I just think that if we talked about it more and dealt with it on an actual conversational level, instead of getting angry and getting just downright wrong and rude about it, I feel like we could have a conversation about this and it will be resolved in a normal and human way instead of like treating us like animals.
Wow, that's strong comments there. Jayla, you want to add anything to it? It's a big question. Jayla, I think we're having a little bit of difficulty with your connection, so I'm going to,
Anybody would.
yeah. So let's go to Julie.
Ways, with the, and
So obviously I am not a Black student. So I don't think my opinion here means much. But I think the remnants of slavery, it's undeniable that they're still present and active in this country all across the world. And so I think that's undeniable.
Okay. So I'm going to throw out this fact for not only our student panelists, but also our audience. Many people believe that, and since we're talking about slavery, many people believe that that's something that happened generations and generations and generations ago. And I ask that question because if you look at the 13th Amendment, for example, it still allows for slavery to exist in this country. And if I were to tell you that the last person born into slavery in this country died when I was alive, you know, I'm not that old. So slavery isn't that far in the past. And to the points that some of our students made, the remnants still affect us to this day. And I'd like for our students to consider, because we do have a question out, which is basically a teacher asking, as a white educator, how should they feel comfortable approaching issues that really deal with racism, that deal with the remnants of slavery? In your opinion, as students, how would you like for a white teacher to approach that subject? And we'll start with Sydney.
I think the biggest thing really is to ask your students how they're feeling. We're supposed to know our students individually and what they go through and who they are as a person. And I feel like you can't really understand your students and what they really need unless you ask them. So if you ask them, how do you feel about this? Just a general question. If we talk about the movement that happened this summer, just generally asking, how do you feel about this? I also feel like it starts with the district and higher up. I feel like if you are uncomfortable with the situation, I feel like you should feel comfortable enough to go to your higher up, your principal, and ask, hey, I don't feel uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable with this situation. And can you give me more training on this situation? Is there somebody I can talk to who can express this situation a little bit more and help me with the understanding of it? Because if you're uncomfortable with something, you won't feel comfortable unless you feel you have that training. And I'm not for sure exactly if training is happening in schools for teachers to even feel comfortable talking about it. I can just take personal experience. I don't know about something. I'm going to have to educate myself to make sure that I feel comfortable talking about the situation, because I'm not going to talk about it if I don't know about it. So asking for help is the main thing that I would say, and asking your students how they feel about certain situations.
Great, that's a great answer. So do you think it would be helpful if we had better textbooks that really detailed the history of Black people in this country? And I'm going to throw that to Sydney and Julie for you all to think about that and answer that question. Are textbooks sufficient in that area?
I think you can definitely, we can have an upgrade of textbooks and different uses of textbooks. However, I feel like there's plenty of resources out here. There's plenty of books that you can find from the library, from a thrift store, anything like that, that you can use in your classroom and in your curriculum to integrate Black history. I don't think it necessarily has to be a textbook. I think textbooks are just the general way of teaching students. So I feel like looking for different resources that are going to help students, because we all don't learn in the same way anyway. So using different resources to help different students and help all of your students just being more aware of Black history is what I would suggest, because I think there are plenty of books that can help.
And to
You
kind of
wanna-
piggyback off of what Sydney was saying, I do agree. I think textbooks, honestly, I think textbooks are starting to become more obsolete as teachers and classrooms embrace and begin to gain the ability to embrace different methods of teaching that are able to integrate more things. So, for example, in today's day and age, we use videos really often, in classrooms and that type of thing. And I think keeping information just to textbooks, while I think it should be included in the textbooks that are created after, this point, and from this point on, it should just be a given that Black history is included and integrated thoroughly into these textbooks. But I do think that textbooks, if that's the only place they're coming from, who's in charge of writing those textbooks, right? Is it going to be Black people, Black scholars? Are Black artists going to be featured? Because white academia types writing these textbooks is exactly what we don't need, in my opinion.
Okay, great. We're gonna give Jayla we're gonna see if she can come through now, if her connection's a little bit better. So Jayla, why don't you talk to the textbook issue from your perspective?
I think it depends, like Julie said, it depends on who's writing the textbooks, whether they're more accurate for the teaching that we do. I'm more in favor of videos and other discussion things like books and literature based on African American authors. I feel like they touch a lot of subjects that we face nowadays and that we can have a discussion on that's exemplified in the media a lot of times, like with Black Lives Matters and our struggles and any other systematic oppression that we face. Videos are also a good way to highlight these ideas. There's a lot of dramas, not just documentaries, that also highlight some of the things we struggle and face that can be talked on about, that you can relate to Black history. Things that we face now or going to overcome or things that need to be talked about.
Okay, great. And since you do have a better connection now, I'm gonna ask you to start with our next and final question for me anyway. And that is, if you were to have a conversation with the governor are the powers that be that help form our pedagogy in our schools. What advice would you give to them? And what direction would you give to them? I mean, specifically, what do you want to see happen with regard to teaching Black history and culture in our schools?
I just wanted to focus more on positive contributions. We need to get a lot of speakers and good role models and people that are good representations of Black people in America that are doing positive things right now and that can influence younger kids so that they know they can do it as well. And when we teach on these subjects, I think that they need to be from a more apathetic standpoint to have feelings and emotions conveyed in it. That's how we get
Sydney, let's go to you and get your advice, your wisdom that you would provide to our
good
governor,
discussion on whether
other teachers, the administration, et cetera. What advice would you give? And what do you want to see happen?
I would say that as of right now, teaching is very curriculum based, and I understand why, because of the testing that we have to do and different things like that. However, if it's going to be curriculum based, I believe that Black history should be integrated into all subject areas. Black history is in February to most schools. That's when Black history should be taught. However, I feel like Black history should be taught year round. If we learn how to integrate it into different content areas like math, science, then we are able to give our students a better understanding of Black history and culture, because it is American history. I think that we're forgetting that Black history is American history. So if we teach about American history throughout all the content areas, we should be able to teach Black history through all the content areas. I also believe that with administration and with colleges, we should be recruiting Black educators, because I feel like students need to be able to see that they are able to be in positions like being an educator, being a principal, being on the administration board. And I feel like with being at Northern, I have seen that with being the only African American female in my classes for 4 years, it has been very difficult on me. And I do see in the classes where me being an African American woman will benefit other students. So I feel like if we start at that level and look at the different requirements that we're having teachers to have to get into these education programs, and we change the requirements a little bit, then we can recruit more Black educators, because we do need other people who are not just Caucasian Americans. Although I feel like they can get the training and they can learn their students a little bit more and develop that Black history, I guess, curriculum in their classrooms. I do think there is nothing better than being able to see someone who looks like you in the classroom. And if you don't have that, then it's just very different. It's very different. So I would say recruitment and the curriculum, and integrating Black history into the content areas of the curriculum.
Excellent, excellent. Emil, you want to give your opinion on that?
Sorry. I think like basically what Sydney said is, I feel like if they had more recruiters, if our teachers actually talked to like actual Black, historical figures, and actually just talk to someone, it doesn't even have to be like a Black teacher or anything. Like if you talk to your community, or you talk to someone that you think will have more experience or understands this topic more, talk to them, learn from them. It does, but to the governor, I do believe that if they have more training with it, and they, I guess, just understood it a little bit more from someone else's perspective, instead of just hearing what they hear or learning what they brought up to learn, I feel like it would be tremendous help to all students across the globe. I truly believe that.
Julie, same question to you. What's your advice? What would be your direction to the administration? how would you counsel them into being better at doing this?
I think my fellow panelists have done an excellent job so far of outlining the way that our governor should proceed, or educators in general should proceed. I really loved Jayla's point specifically about emphasizing the positive impacts of Black leaders throughout history instead of simply focusing on the negative things that have happened. I think that emphasizing, and this kind of goes back to making it an interdisciplinary pursuit instead of just in history classes, but like, okay, if we're in a science class and there was a Black figure in history who like did something with science and the topic you're learning about, learn about them. You know, if you're in art class and there is a Black artist who had a significant impact on the type of art that you're focusing on, focus on that artist, highlight that artist's work, make sure that Black innovators and artists are being recognized within their curriculum as well. And I think another great point was about making sure to recruit more Black educators, because it is important that students see themselves and have someone who can empathize with them when they're going through the learning process. Because I mean, I obviously can't understand what that's like, and I think that that's the problem. That's the problem. And so when we are learning about Black history, I think from the governor's perspective, making sure that those changes happen, not just in schools that have a large Black student population, but also schools that don't, I think is going to be really critical. And like I mentioned before, I think that it's the job of public educators to hold institutions like the College Board and like the IB programs accountable, and making sure that they integrate Black history into all of their programs as well, because they really have a responsibility to do so, seeing as how they are nationally standardized, right? So even if Kentucky itself is making these changes, you don't know if you know other states are doing so. And so I think that's a great way for nationally to kind of stand together on that. And I think it's public educators' job to kind of lobby for that in the spaces that they have that sway.
Can I also
And
add something?
go ahead.
So
Absolutely.
yesterday I was watching a live video on Instagram, and it talked about, is professional development really professional development, or are they meetings? And so when Julie was talking, I just thought about, with professional development, it's usually you have to gain a certain amount of hours, but it's not very specific on what type of professional development you have to get. And so maybe if we held our teachers and our principals accountable and said, hey, these are different aspects of professional development that you need, then maybe teachers would get that training, get that comfortableness if they were getting different trainings that were geared towards Black history. But instead of just saying, oh, you need 15 hours of professional development, say this is where you need professional development at, and being more strategic and specific with that.
That's great. So I'm going to do something that's dangerous. I'm going to attempt to sum up some of the things that I've heard from you all today. And that is, Black history is American history, and it shouldn't be thought of in the negative. I mean, to your point, we have great Black authors that should be woven into English courses and literature courses. We have great Black artists that should be part of teaching art. We have amazing scientists like Percy L. Julian, who was an amazing scientist that should be taught. So in some, teachers, white teachers, Black teachers, brown teachers, should not be fearful of teaching Black history for fear of offending students, especially because if you're knowledgeable about Black history and culture, you will know that it has contributed positively to this country in many, many ways. Do you all want to comment on that? Did I sum that up pretty well? You're shaking your head, but Julie, Emil,
You did
Sydney,
great on
anybody?
that one.
Thank you. So we're still running a little bit ahead. I'm going to ask our producers here if it's okay if I introduce the next subject. But first, I want to thank our student panelists. Your wisdom was sage. It was amazing. You all are amazing young people and young leaders, and I just would hope that you would continue to put yourselves out there and speak out on this subject, because it's very, very important. So if our audience can give them a round of applause virtually, that would be greatly appreciated.